Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to spend some time talking about behavioral contracts. Now when we talked about self-management, one of the techniques or strategies that we mentioned was a behavioral contract. It's kind of written document that we can use to help us change our behavior in some way. And these can actually be very common, especially trained ABA specialists use behavioral contracts all the time to help others change their behavior. So let's look at an example. Say Steve is having trouble finishing his dissertation. This happens a lot more frequently than you would think. I've heard of people taking 9, upwards of 10 years to finish their dissertation, which is ridiculous. But some people do have a hard time finishing up the dissertation. Finds ways of putting it off, distractions, excuses not to do it, etc., etc. And Steve finally decided, all right, I want to finish this. I want to get out of grad school. I'm going to go see a clinical graduate student to help me figure out a way to actually follow through and finish this. So he sets up a behavioral contract with the graduate student, setting reasonable goals. I'm going to write 9 pages a week of my dissertation, setting a contingency. All right, what's going to happen if I don't accomplish the specific goal that I set? Could be rewards, could be punishments, and then actually putting this into a contract. So every week has to complete 9 pages, brings in those 9 pages to the clinical graduate student, shows them, and then a new contract is signed. So every week this happens again. And at the end of every week, Steve has to show these pages and then either receives the reward or the punishment as a result. So again, using this behavioral contract and reinforcement or punishment to encourage a specific behavior to occur. This can also be utilized especially in family counseling situations. Maybe a child isn't getting along well with its family and vice versa. Maybe the parents think that the child, Timmy, for example, spends too much time away from home, and Timmy thinks that his parents are a little overbearing. How can we use a behavioral contract to work things out? Well, if the parents give a little and the child gives a little, meet a little bit halfway in the middle, we can write up a contract that kind of irons out the details. And again, using specific details, specific goals for each behavioral change, we can work out an amicable solution to help both individuals get what they want, or help both parties in this situation, the parents and Timmy, to change their behaviors that will help the others, that will help the other party feel a little bit better about the situation. So, as I mentioned before, behavioral contracts are written agreements between 2 parties. Sometimes this is between one person and a contract manager, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and sometimes it's between 2 separate parties who want the other party to change some kind of behavior. The specific behaviors that need to be changed are specified in there, and also the consequence that is delivered. Again, that can be a reward or a punishment. Also, we need to list how the behaviors will be measured. So imagine a situation where both parties want the other to change their behavior. At the end of a week, say the week is the time that's being passed, each party needs to kind of prove to the other that they've changed their behavior in some way. And so how is this proof going to be delivered? Is it going to be some kind of recording that they have? Is it some kind of maybe permanent product, which we've talked about? Maybe an automatic recording. So an example of a permanent product with the dissertation could be actually handing in those 9 pages of the dissertation, which suggests that Steve was actually writing. An automated recording could be a Fitbit or a pedometer showing that, yes, I have run this far, or yes, I have worked out this many times this week. Here, you can see. Or we could use direct observation. Again, time consuming, as we've mentioned before, and not always possible, but could be used to prove that this behavior has changed in some way. So we've talked about behaviors, we've talked about consequences, we've talked about how we're measuring the behavior. We also need to outline when the behavior needs to be performed. So we talked about 9 pages of the dissertation being done every week. It doesn't always have to be every week. It could be a page a day. It could be 18 pages per month. There are lots of different ways that we can use. Say, in the Timmy example, maybe Timmy was staying out too late. So that time window, instead of staying out until 8 o'clock at night, might shift to 7 o'clock. So again, time is a very important component often of these behavioral contracts. And then lastly, we need to figure out how the contingencies are going to be implemented. Who's going to follow through with the rewards or punishments? Oftentimes a third party will do so, a contract manager, but sometimes, especially if you have two different parties, it's one party implementing the reward for the other and vice versa. So what are the different types of contracts that we can actually create? We can have a one-party contract or a unilateral contract. That's where one person wants to change their own behavior and they get a contract manager to help them follow through with this. So again, in writing, the other person, the contract manager, is there to make sure that a person is following through with their behaviors. They're collecting the evidence after the time period has elapsed and then either delivering the reward or punishment. The reinforcer or the punishment. We've talked a little bit about how sometimes friends might not always be the best to deliver punishments, especially. So oftentimes the best contract managers to use are managers that have little to no relationship with the client, kind of separated and more willing to deliver some of these maybe unpleasant punishments. So we can have the one-party contracts. We can also have two-party contracts or bilateral contracts. These are a lot more complicated and sometimes a lot more difficult to iron out. We typically see that each party has some kind of relationship with each other and each party is dissatisfied with a specific behavior of the other party. So both parties have agreed to, okay, I will change my behavior in some way if you do the same to this other behavior. Sometimes we see that these behaviors reinforce each other. So rather than having a specific separate contingency or a separate reinforcer or punisher, we see that if one person changes their behavior, that's going to increase the likelihood of the other person changing their behavior. So this would be an example of a quid pro quo contract, where one is reinforcing the other. Sometimes if one person isn't performing the behavior, then the other will also cease to perform it, sometimes intentionally. So in those situations, it's often best to use a parallel contract. There's separate contingencies, separate reinforcers or punishers for each behavior. So Jim might want to reduce his knuckle cracking because it's bothering Judy. So Jim's reinforcer is that if he reduces his knuckle cracking, he gets to watch sports. Whereas Judy, her nail biting gets on Jim's skin, but if she follows through in reducing that behavior, she gets to go shopping. Stereotypes aside, this is kind of the idea where each person has a different consequence associated with the reduction in the behavior. So with these contracts, we often see negotiation. Not as much with one-party contracts. It's simply the person trying to figure out, all right, what are the specific behaviors and the specific goals I have? It gets much more complicated with two-party contracts. Oftentimes, two-party contracts occur because there is some kind of conflict between each party, and so negotiations can be pretty tense. For that reason, it's best to have some kind of moderator, especially a moderator who doesn't have strong ties to both or either party, that can help them find this ideal middle ground to where each person is changing their behavior in a way that's acceptable to not only the other person who doesn't like it, but also the person who's doing the behavior. So why do behavioral contracts work? Well, as we've talked about briefly in some of the other videos, it's a form of antecedent manipulation. The fact that the contract in itself exists is a reminder that you, in some way, shape, or form, want to change your behavior. So the fact that you're thinking about this contract is actually going to make it more likely to increase or decrease that behavior. Increase the behavioral deficits, decrease the behavioral excesses. It's also a form of social support. Even with one-party contracts, you have someone else there who, for the most part, is going to be encouraging you to change your behavior in some way. It can also be the case where every time you see the contract manager or the other party, that's another form of antecedent manipulation. You're reminded of the contract. It's a context or a cue that encourages you to increase or decrease that behavior. And lastly, a behavioral contract is a rule-governed behavior. The contract is a prompt in the environment that makes it more likely for the behavior to occur if you want to increase it, or not occur if you want to decrease it. The fact that you're constantly thinking about this contract can create some form of anxiety that can only be released if you actually perform the behavior. You're less likely to have that release if you don't perform the behavior that you've been performing a lot. But that release oftentimes occurs, the reduction occurs, if you follow through with the behavior that you don't often do, that behavioral deficit. So behavioral contracts are extremely common, especially in ABA. It can help people quit smoking, help people lose weight or maintain weight, help people exercise, help people perform better in a classroom setting or a school setting. And it's especially helpful in couples therapy, where each person wants the other to change their behavior in some way, especially through a quid pro quo contract that allows couples to kind of help people meet in the middle. So that's all I have today about behavioral contracts. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I will see you all in the next video.